Hi, everybody. Sorry, I have to hear myself. It is more than a pleasure to get to talk to Phil about his new book, because I have admired his writing since I read Redeployment and wrote about it in the New Yorker almost 10 years ago, and Missionaries, his first novel, and now Uncertain Ground, which is just a remarkable book of essays. Books of essays can be a hard sell. They can be loose and disjointed and maybe even lacking a total reason for existence. This book does not lack any reason for existence. It needs to exist, and it coheres brilliantly and kind of gains the force and the emotional depth of a novel as you read it, because it keeps on getting broader and deeper as it goes along. It's not just a collection, it's actually a reading experience, which is an unusual thing for a book of essays. So I just want to read one paragraph to tell you why I love Phil's writing so much, and have since I first read the stories in Redeployment. This is the last paragraph of one of the main essays in the book, called Citizen Soldier. No civilian can assume the moral burdens felt at a gut level by participants in war, but all can show an equal commitment to their country, an equal assumption of the obligations inherent in citizenship, and an equal bias for action. Ideals are one thing. The messy business of putting them into practice is another. That means giving up any claim to moral purity. That means getting your hands dirty. That's Phil's voice in nonfiction, which is, to me, similar to his voice in fiction, not quite the same, depending on the story, the narrator, but it's unmistakable, and I would know it anywhere. It's a voice that is stringent and tough and demanding and rigorous, but also open to a kind of warmth and gentleness that allows the reader not to feel like you're being preached at or lectured to, but like you're being invited to participate in an attempt to make us all a bit better. It's idealistic, it's hard-bitten from experience without being cynical, and it's just so honest. Honesty is the touchstone of all of Phil's writing, and for me, honesty is the most important virtue any writer can have, along with talent, and Phil has both, so it's really great to get to talk to you tonight, Phil.
Thank you. I mean, I don't know what to say to that other than it's amazing to talk to you as well. And I've been a reader of your fiction, nonfiction, and for a long time.
No one reads my fiction.
And yeah, I mean, actually, God, like several decades at this point. And I think that there's that sort of desire to not give up on idealism, while also a desire not to allow that to mean that you close your eyes to how badly things have sometimes turned out. That is, I think something that I saw in your work, and that hopefully I try and put forward in mine.
Well, I feel there are connections, and there's an overlap in sensibility. But let's talk about these essays. So the book actually is divided into, I think, 4 parts?
4 parts, yeah.
So part of the experience of reading it is you go from war to the burdens of war on soldiers and citizens, to the writing about war, fiction, to faith and what Phil's journey as a Catholic has been like, as a Catholic whose faith was pretty sorely tested in Iraq, I think. Phil, I should say, is a Marine Corps veteran and served a long tour in Iraq and Anbar province during a pretty interesting year there. We might have been in Iraq at the same time. My last trip there was the very beginning of your tour, so.
Yeah, went in February 2000. January 2007.
Yeah, that was my last time there. So you write a lot about citizenship, and in fact, it seems that your reason for joining the Marine Corps, other than whatever fantasies a boy has about glory and heroism, was a kind of higher ideal of service and of what you owed your country and of what you felt citizenship required of you. Is that
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I didn't grow up wanting to join the military. I wasn't like somebody who was enamored of the I mean, didn't hate it or anything, but I wanted to be a diplomat when I was, growing up. My maternal grandfather had been a diplomat, and I always thought that was amazing. And my mother and my sisters, they grew up all over the world. At one point, they had all these incredible stories. My grandfather actually accepted the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of Henry Kissinger because he was ambassador to Norway when Kissinger won the Peace Prize. Yeah.
Why didn't Kissinger accept it on his own behalf?
Controversial, right? And so easier to send the ambassador, and the students threw snowballs at his car, which I think is a delightfully Scandinavian film.
That's called a riot in Norway.
yeah. And then, he was ambassador to Czechoslovakia, which I'm researching now. But my aunts have great stories from that time. Everybody was a spy. One of my aunt who was here went on a day trip from Prague, and on the way back, she kept getting on the wrong train. And then eventually some guy just comes out of the crowd in perfect English, is like, you get on this train, you take it, and it takes you home. And it was the Czech spy who was like, I'm never getting home to see my family. Yeah.
Please get on the goddamn train.
I'm breaking my cover. But so that's what I wanted to do, and I was always fascinated, by America's foreign policy and by our role in the world, right? Like, which is the connection with the military, this sense of like, what does America mean in the world, right? How does it interact with other countries? How can it do that to the good? How has it done that to the bad? And then service was always really important to my family. My dad was in the Peace Corps. My mother worked in international medical aid for years. And so, my idea is I'm going to do something in service to the country at some point, and be hopefully a useful citizen. Well, I went to college in 2001, so, that's what you do.
Well, you knew then that you were going to deploy to a war zone, didn't you, when you joined?
Yeah, I mean, that was the hope. I mean, if you joined during Iraq and Afghanistan, like, I would feel very strange if they didn't send me to a war zone. I volunteered to get a post where I would go. Not that I was doing anything dangerous, by the way. I was a staff officer, right? Like,
you say that over and over in the book. This self-deprecation is one of the recurring themes of this book. Phil's refusal to accept any hint of courage or heroism in his 13 months in Iraq, right?
Right, but I was a staff, like, so this is the thing, like, if you tell people who don't have that much military experience, like I was in Iraq during the surge, which is this very violent time, like, they think, what they imagine happened. My older brother was in Ramadi in 2006 as the combat engineer or platoon commander attached to an infantry company. Ramadi 2006, terrible. Like, it was not like on Sundays in the chow hall they had cobbler day, and you're eating cherry cobbler with ice cream. This is a different experience.
You could eat cobbler in the chow hall and run over an IED.
I went to Iraq, but yeah, so it's there's always this thing where, like, you see in public life, and that's actually a small theme, particularly in the essay in this book on Eric Greitens, where people will leverage people's ideas of what the military was, what military service is. Like Greitens having been a Navy SEAL. And
maybe we should say who Eric Greitens is and why he's a loathsome character. There's an essay about him in the book.
The disgraced former general of Missouri, who
former governor of Missouri.
Governor of Missouri.
You're back in the Marine Corps.
Yeah. He had been in the Navy SEALs, but he never actually led SEALs in combat, right? And there's a sort of complicated backstory as to what happened with him when he was in the SEALs. But when he got out, he sort of, he had a combat action badge. There'd been like a chlorine bomb attack on his barracks. He'd inhaled chlorine gas, so he had a Purple Heart. He had been in combat. But sort of at different points, he would sort of leverage himself to sort of fit the political moment. He put out a book called The Heart and the Fist, and it happened came out right as the Osama bin Laden raid, dropped, and all of a sudden, like, he was on every talk show, and he was explaining how Navy SEALs do things, without ever mentioning, like, I never actually did this, in real life. And he talked to Harvard Business School about, being a leader and managing the heart and the fist, and then he decided to go into politics, and all of a sudden he became a sort of blowhard conservative.
He had been a lifelong Democrat, right?
Yes, yeah. And just kind of like perfectly matched, like, oh, this is what this audience would like to hear, like, and this is their expectations of what a Navy SEAL is. And also, if I mention these aspects of my resume but don't clarify the other aspects, people will fill in the gaps. And I'm very conscious of the fact that I want to present myself honestly, and I'm aware of what people will fill in.
So you were going in the other direction from Eric Brighton's and almost hang the sign around your neck. Did not see combat while in the Marine Corps.
Oh yeah, because people will give you crap about it, right? Like I showed up to a students group and like this veteran came in. And he was like ready to just attack me because he read my first story. He was like, this guy wasn't in the infantry. What is he writing about the infantry? First story in my first book. And then he was like, oh, like, you write from all different perspectives and you wrote an op-ed in the New York Times where you were like, I was a pogue. He's like, okay, we're cool, man. That story's actually pretty good.
His literary judgment changed when he knew that you were not claiming to have been in the infantry.
Right.
Right. Well, this is part of what I admire so much and like so much about Phil's writing is it's just this relentless honesty, but also a kind of cold eye cast on yourself and on others. And so you, in essay after essay in this book, you describe the relation between returning troops or veterans and civilians.
Yeah.
And it's also saturates redeployment. And that relationship you subject to so much scrutiny, honest scrutiny, that it just falls to pieces at every turn. There are so many illusions, so much dishonesty, so much desire for it to be something it isn't. And I think that's really one of your biggest concerns as a writer is to get that relationship right.
Yeah.
Because we as Americans have so fouled it that it is wrong at every turn. Citizens want to both worship soldiers but also not know what they're doing over there in our name. Soldiers want to come back and lord it over civilians as morally superior to what does that one guy write on Facebook or something, your worthless sponge life. That's the life of, that's us.
Well, it's like Rob O'Neill. Every once in a while, something will happen in American political life where Rob O'Neill, who's the Navy SEAL who claims to have shot bin Laden,
and even that claim is somehow a violation of the code of the SEALs, right?
He has a black name, black mark amongst sort of Navy SEALs who are of a different stripe. But he'll be like, I can't believe I risked my life for you, because. I don't know, because we voted for Biden or because whatever,
Because we're sitting in a bookstore on Flatbush Avenue.
Yes. Yeah. We're all, especially us, are very disappointing to Rob O'Neill, and he's sorry he risked his life for you.
So what relationship should we aspire to? What should be, and you have many beautiful sentences that, I hate to say this, but I wish every American would read, in which you describe how we could cut through the bullshit and see one another in that paragraph I read as fellow citizens who all have a responsibility. It's not like we can shove it off onto the 1% who serve, but it's also not like the 1% who serve are the only ones who have any responsibility. So that's sort of, is that kind of the goal that you're moving toward?
Yeah, I think, when I first come back, and the essays are written from 2010 is I think the earliest one, and the last one in the book is written in August of last year during fall of Kabul. And come back from a war zone, I think there's sort of two basic questions, which are like, all right, what the hell was that? And what is this country, which all of a sudden looks very strange, right? And what is the tether between the two of those? Because the political decisions that are made here determine everything that's happening overseas. During my first time back, in the middle of my tour, I got 2 weeks leave. I went to New York, and we had a combat hospital where people fresh from the battlefield were taken in. The surgeons were part of my unit, and I'd seen a Marine die there. And then within a week, I flew home and I was in New York and walking down Madison Avenue, right? And it's just a very strange juxtaposition. I later talked to a photojournalist who was like, "You never go to New York right after a war zone, It's like, go
What were you thinking?
somewhere else."
Well, my parents lived there.
And a buddy in the audience who went to New Orleans, it's like, that's a much better call.
Just blotted out.
And so, like, and you're right, like, you come back and you feel like you have a license to pontificate about what the war meant. But of course, when you were over there, you just saw like a tiny piece. Even me, as like a public affairs officer, where I'd spend time with a lot of different units and go to different places and theoretically got a little at different pieces. Your perspective is so limited, and then time really changes things, especially as you get out. And the weird things about this war is like, it's very easy to be like, those civilians living their worthless sponge lives, and then you get out, and your buddies are still in, and you're like living in New York. And I was literally in a bar in, this is how I found out the guy that I worked with when I was in Iraq got shot in Afghanistan. I was in a bar, I was working on a novel that was never published, in a bar in Greenpoint. And the time for writing was ending because it was like a coffee shop and bar, and they were switching to the night scene, which involved a band setting up, and there was literally a woman with a ukulele, right? So it's like the most Greenpoint band you could possibly imagine. And I get a call this guy that we knew got shot in the arm. He's okay. I mean, he's permanent damage to the arm, but he's otherwise good. And it's just like, what are these two worlds? And like, I'm kind of more a part of the ukulele right now, and how do I reconcile that? And what should, because I used to joke that like a lot of these essays, like the kind of core of rage, right? Because there's something really emotionally important that feels like it's being violated in the way that we go about things, and that we're not dealing with or not approaching with seriously. But sometimes like that problem is internal. So I used to joke that the sort of working title of every essay that I wrote was "Fuck all you fucking fuckers," including myself. And so, yeah, that change happens as time goes by, as I'm moving into civilian society, as the wars are going on, as they're not going well, and as political decisions are being made, which are further sort of obscuring the wars from view. So we switch from a place where, like when I was in, I can talk about the alienation of coming home, which is an old soldier. I mean, like, Odysseus comes back to Ithaca and doesn't recognize it, right? It's the oldest sort of thing in the book, is feeling slightly alienated from the place you come back to, even if you haven't been to war. But then there's this way in which there was a real debate about the wars, and our politics were reshaped by those debates about the wars. I mean, Barack Obama doesn't beat Hillary Clinton probably without Hillary Clinton's vote for the Iraq War. And there was a huge kind of media spectacle around the testimony over the surge in 2007 when I was there, and what our strategy was, and the administration was articulating in very granular detail a strategy and what success was supposed to look like. And then, we move into a place where I describe later in the book, it's during Obama's presidency. And what has happened is, with great fanfare, he's pulled troops out of Iraq, and then ISIS rises up. And so there's a desire to fight ISIS, which is, I think, a justifiable use of American power. I mean, like I've traveled through Iraq and met people who survived the genocide. I've met people who were enslaved by ISIS. Like, I'm fine with us using American power to do that. But Obama did not want to get Congress to authorize the use of military force against ISIS after having supposedly ended the war. And so he just decided that the authorization that we had from 2001 applied, that we didn't need congressional approval. They sort of, they said that, you know, like, we're sending advisors in, but we're not sending boots on the ground because, you know, special operators ride around the hoverboards, I guess. There was this sort of infamous moment in a press conference, I mean, infamous if you follow these things, where one of these guys was in combat, and they were trying to explain that we weren't sending troops into combat, even though sometimes troops ended up in a combat situation. And I did an event in 2015 while we're ramping up, and at this point, you know, the fight against ISIS is underway. We're ramping up, you know, the number of people that we have in the country. And Ambassador Susan Rice introduces me and a couple of the folks. And she's, you know, there's a panel on veterans issues, and she says, you know, this issue is very important to us. The Obama administration, one of our proudest accomplishments is ending the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? And the audience, by the way, for this event was like active duty military. Generals, Mike Mullen is there. It's like 3- and 4-star generals. Tony Blinken's there, and about a dozen severely injured troops. I was like, who are you lying to? Like, somebody in the audience went, right? But like some of these guys are like involved in the actual planning for sending people over, right? So we had a situation where the wars were going on, but it wasn't just that, like, oh, Americans aren't involved. No, our political leaders were actively trying to ensure that we weren't involved, ensure that we weren't engaged in the wars.
I was told by a soldier in Afghanistan that Dennis McDonough, who was Obama's chief of staff, went to Afghanistan and said, our goal is to keep the war on page 13. So, in other words, we don't want the public to really know what's going on, and we're going to do everything we can. We'll call it training and advising. We'll do whatever we can to keep it quiet. So for you, this seems to have stripped away some of the other ideas and feelings you came home with. Because you came home convinced that you had served in a winning cause, because Anbar province saw
Violence went down a lot.
A major drop in violence in the year that you were there, entirely because of your service. And it was the only really positive turn of the entire experience in Iraq, I would say. And you were there for it. So you came home not unreasonably thinking we actually did something good, and instead the public either doesn't want to hear about it, or thinks that it is just a hopeless cause, or congratulates you, thanks you for your service, and then their eyes glaze over as soon as you start to tell them anything about it, or they pity you. In one moment in an essay, you speak at a bookstore, and afterward a woman comes up to you and starts stroking your back and saying, I really admire your courage for saying that, and
It was like I was like a startled horse in a show.
right.
You know?
So there's just all these strange reactions from civilians and politicians. They just don't know how to talk to you. And so you are understandably alienated, angry, and you start to write. So why did you become a writer? That's the question I'm really trying to get at. How did all of this make you want to become a writer?
So, because I was a big reader, you know, the disease strikes young. But I would also say, so I was always a big reader. I always loved books. I studied writing when I was in college. I was an English major, history minor. Writing was something that I was really interested in. But when I was writing before I went to Iraq, I think the distinction that I like to make is I was writing stories to try and write good stories when I was, an undergraduate order. And when I came back from Iraq, I started writing things because I wanted to communicate something. And that made the writing feel very different.
You sort of had an agenda when you came back, right? You wanted to write in order to push your readers into a certain direction. You write about this in one of your essays.
Yeah, I mean, I thought I had a lot of, you come back from war and you feel like you have a license to pontificate, right? But particularly with fiction writing, pontificating is so freaking boring. I just can't. And also, like, when you're pontificating in fiction, the characters start to feel thin and dull, and you just like, I don't know, I should make this guy funnier and more interesting and give him a better argument. And otherwise, why am I writing this, you know? I never understood writers who will, like, put a character in their books with a character whose politics they hate, and then just have that character say the dumbest version of that argument. And it's like you made that. Like, he's dumb because you made him dumb. Like, if I show up to, like, a first grader's karate class and beat the living hell out of everybody in the class, like, that doesn't mean that I'm Bruce Lee, you know? Like, just, I stacked the odds. And so the process of writing fiction just kind of, like, I think it undermined a lot of those, like, very comforting kind of, because there's a sort of set of narratives you can easily slot into, and they're determined by kind of cultural tropes and also our politics, right? And I just, you know, I think that the process of writing, having a kind of eye that's geared towards fiction is about towards particularity and specificity, and just always kind of finding something that's more interesting, that pushes you in more uncomfortable directions. And that kind of screws up your ability to pontificate, right? Or to divide the world up into nice, neat categories where how you're supposed to act is clear. And so, and that sort of process of working on fiction, I think, then bled into the kind of nonfiction that I was writing.
Well, that's interesting, because in one of the essays called Man of War, you describe coming home and kind of wanting to stick it to the civilians. Like, you are failing in your civic duties. You are uninterested in this war. You put it all on us. You want to tell us what heroes we are, but you really don't want to take any responsibility for the wars that we're fighting in your name. And that's kind of a fundamental critique you have really throughout the book about America in the 20 years of the 9/11 wars and how it became wars that we didn't want to know about. But then you write, so you're talking about beginning to write fiction. So that was one motivation. But there was another messier motivation that I could not quite have articulated at the time. It was less about a message to unload upon my reader and more about a group of unquiet memories that hung around in my head, cluttering up the place without serving as fodder for any easily digestible moral of the sort I wanted to impart. They were memories like the following: how funny it could be to talk about dead bodies, what it looked like seeing dirty soldiers back from a patrol eating cherry cobbler in the TQ mess hall, the voice of that doctor as he told me what it had felt like treating those 2 tortured Iraqis, watching a man shepherd a group of 6 sheep with mucus hanging from their snouts, and the adjustments men made in the summer months to deal with ball sweat. And those are the unbidden, involuntary memories that just kept coming at you until you realize that this really is what I have to write. Ralph Ellison wrote a wonderful essay about how he wrote Invisible Man, and he says exactly the same thing. He had this kind of high-minded idea of writing about the effect of the Communist Party on Harlem,
Right.
And yet this kind of laughing, sneering, ironic voice kept popping into his head until finally he could not defy it or deny it, and he began writing in something that could take into account that voice, and that became Invisible Man. And that is what fiction does. It just won't let you follow your idea down to its neatly prescribed end.
Yeah, and also, you know, there's a sort of, John Greenlight has an essay where he talks about the prim moral style of the ideologue, right? And so there's that, and then there's the sort of, Emerson on the comedic talks about how, you know, men of reason don't joke. They see, you know, how things are supposed to be. But nothing is funnier. Like, the comedic comes when there's somebody who agrees with the philosopher, the man of reason, about the way things should be. But he has sympathy for the detected, skulking institutions, right? For the humanity that you see all around you, and just kind of the discrepancy between the two makes his eyes run over with laughter. And I think that sort of, I think my fictional mode is to have some degree of sympathy for the detected, skulking institutions, of which we're all a part, which is just the kind of inherent messiness and complexity of human life, without giving up on the ideals that you're hopefully aiming toward.
Well, I think following that subversive voice is what made you a fiction writer. I mean, that is what made Redeployment, with its incredible range of narrative voices, such a compelling work. And yet you continued all through those years, while you were writing Redeployment, while you were writing Missionaries, up till now, to write essays. So what role do essays play for you as a writer that fiction doesn't?
Fiction is inviting somebody into an experience, right? These essays are sort of inviting somebody along an argument, right? Sometimes an argument that I'm having with myself. And there's some of the essays are sort of more memoirish type things. Some of them are just like kind of investigations where it's like, okay, there are these ideas in American life that I don't think you can really understand unless you delve into the history, because you don't even know what the words you're using mean, really. So Citizen Soldier, there's this long essay which is about the relationship between the citizen and the soldier, but it also deals with the history of how we've conceptualized the citizen soldier, starting with the revolution. There's a long piece on firearms and the kind of construction of a mythology around that. There's one piece, because one of the things that I'm interested in is we're so defined by war in terms of our sort of historical imagination, and wars are this sort of place of idealism and backsliding, and also sort of rising xenophobia accompanies wars and all sorts of other things. And so, I wanted to tell the story of these two Iraqi interpreters, one who who got a visa, came to America, got his citizenship, joined the army and went back to Iraq, and one who at the time of the writing was still in Iraq. He's since, thankfully, made it over since that piece was published. And I wanted to pair their stories not just with the contemporary debates about immigration, fears of Muslims, and how to think about somebody who has risked their lives alongside Marines, but is not an American citizen and sort of in limbo. But with the story of Charles White Whittlesey, who's like one of the great heroes of World War I, and sort of aspects of his story that, and his ultimate suicide that I thought were sort of underdeveloped, but maybe seemed related to the way in which kind of every ideal that he might have felt he was going into the war with was betrayed in the aftermath of the war, and his own feeling about his unit, which what was left out in the popular mythologizing of his unit, which was surrounded by Germans, which held out for days and days, being completely surrounded, was actually composed of a bunch of immigrants, precisely the kind of people that American political leaders were thinking of restricting from the country in the first quota laws that we had right after World War I. And so, like, it's this way in which, it's inviting somebody into an argument that I'm having with myself. Like, this is a thing that is just, I feel like it's so vital. But hopefully, I never want it to be simply preaching, but rather like, this deeply concerns me. Here's this argument. I want you to be along with me as I kind of trace the contours of it.
Yeah, I think that's what makes the essay its own literary form. And a good essay has a kind of plot that not the same plot as fiction, but a plot in which the reader keeps learning something new and being surprised, and it takes turns that aren't expected from the first paragraph until you reach a place that you never thought you were going to get to by the end. And I think the essays in this book do that. They are not afraid of complexity or of self-criticism or of doubting your own authority to say the thing that you want to say, and yet the need to try to understand. And it's so at odds with our culture today, where the way you become known as a writer is by crushing people on social media, and by having the last word, and by bringing it all down to one simple sentence. So how do you approach the essay as a form? Who do you read? How do you learn the craft, and how do you resist? You're on Twitter, I know that, but how do you resist the Twitterization of your essays?
I mean, you read good essays. You read George Packer. No, but I think that willingness to take risks is in your essays. I think Ellison is actually, it's funny that you mention Ellison because his essays are very important to me. You know, Virginia Woolf has an essay on the essay as a form, you know, where she's talking about how the purpose of the essay is to give pleasure, right? And how when you read it, you'd feel like, you know, like a sort of curtain is being drawn around. And the personality of the person who's talking to you is so important, right? And and whether that personality can actually stand up in that kind of, you know,
There is
eye-to-eye.
nowhere to hide in an essay. You are alone on a stage, and your character, essentially,
Mhm.
personality, will keep your audience or make them want to throw snowballs at you.
Mrs. Wolfe, we are appalled by the sight of trivial personalities decomposing in the eternity of print. So the goal is not to be a trivial personality decomposing in the eternity of print.
Yeah, the eternity of print. May that never be said about either of us as we decompose. Yeah, I mean, it is a high wire act in some ways, more dangerous than fiction because you're naked. You're just speaking directly to the reader in your own voice, and the quality of your voice and your ideas and your prose is all you've got. So you have to have something to say, you have to be honest, and you have to say it well. So for a book of essays to have the propulsion that this one does, you should really read it from start to finish because it has this quality of taking you on a journey. It's a really rare thing. So Phil, you said, I want to get down to something quite fundamental here. What do we do as Americans? What are we going to do? Because you went into the Marine Corps with certain ideals of service. You came out with those ideals somewhat roughed up but still intact. You had some bad feelings about your fellow Americans back home. And the last essay in not The Bound Galley, but the book, is the most profoundly bitter and unhappy thing I've read about the 20 years of the 9/11 wars. It is a complete repudiation of any idea that there was something worthwhile here that has been achieved, as far as I remember, because I didn't read it because I only had The Bound Galleys. So tell me if I'm wrong about it, but also tell me, where does that leave us as polarized, dysfunctional, shamed Americans? Because you still have, clearly you still have,
Yeah.
this sense that being an American citizen, a democratic citizen, means something, that is a high calling. It's not
Yeah.
just that you take, you give. And yet, the book might leave us at a point where we have to ask ourselves, what are we giving to or for? What is the future for our children, your children and mine? I think about this all the time, and right now I'm in a pretty dark spot.
Yeah.
So tell me
The book,
what you think.
I mean, that essay is written as couples falling and as friends of mine are trying to get Afghans out and failing. And it's incredibly grim work. One friend of mine, somebody that he's working with, dies, is killed, is murdered in that time period. I mean, I was talking to a guy,
An American or an Afghan?
an Afghan,
An Afghan.
yeah, he was trying to, you know, I was talking to a guy and he's working with this woman who's on a Taliban death list, and she had been severely beaten by the Taliban, and she's in the hospital and she has a tube because she's you know, sort of in her stomach and under a false name to hide her, and she's got a large family, and their paperwork is not in order, and this veteran, you know, former army guy whose interpreter saved his life when he was in Afghanistan. He feels like he just, you know, his government has failed in their obligation to these people, so that he feels like, you know, in a very like military, like, so that obligation has fallen upon me. And it's like that you can't, it's not something you can shoulder. And he's working case after case, and she's doesn't, like, it's not clear to her, and why would it be, that like he doesn't have the capability to bring her over. There's just a fundamentally broken system, and he knows that the state of where her papers are in her family is that they're not going to make it on any account unless he can't help her. But from her perspective, he's America. He's not a private citizen who's volunteering all this time to try and work these cases. He's America. He's got a Black Hawk helicopter. He can come and save her anytime. And she asks him, she says, why are our lives not worth saving? And he has no response for her, right? And, you know, I have another friend who is doing this work, and they get 40 names, right? They get a bus, 40 people, and they get to pick who comes out. And he's a third-year law student who was in Afghanistan as a Marine infantryman, 10 years before. He's on the Slack channel that night, and so he volunteers, and two other guys volunteer, and they go through the list, and he says, midway through, I'm like, what the fuck is this? He's like, I'm not an official, nobody elected. Like, why am I deciding who gets to go and who doesn't, right? And he's making these like brutal choices, and there's a woman that he's been working with since the beginning of August, trying to get her out, and she doesn't really meet the criteria, for this particular bus. And he really wants to put her on because he knows her, and he's been working with her for a while. But he's like, I have to be serious, I have to, and in this system that doesn't make any sense, where who gets out and who gets in is totally crazy. And he goes through it, and they're really serious, and they put the names on. By the end of it, he's like, I'm done. And they put it through, and the people get ready to leave. And then the next morning, they're like, oh, the bus got redirected to an orphanage. So like, that was all for nothing. None of your names are getting out. And they're like, well, an orphanage, what can you say? And so that essay is trying to capture that kind of anger. And I think it's more raw, it's less measured than a lot of the other essays in the book. But I wanted there to be something that raw in the book, and I felt like it was right to have something that raw in the book. And jarring. And, there are bits in that essay that piss people off. I quote Jake, says something in that essay of like, he's talking about like, it's difficult for me to, something I can push against, not necessarily something I can justify, but it's like difficult for me to trust people from my time who didn't join the military, because
What you said in the essay was,
what Jake said.
no, this was you. You said, I think, it's about volunteering, if it's right for you or not, but we always thought that was a trick question.
Right, it's a volunteer in the military, but that's a trick question.
The trick question is,
you're supposed to say yes.
You gotta say yes, or else you've just shown that you're not really worth it.
Right. And so,
Did someone else say that? Sorry.
that was Jake.
I keep hearing Phil say
Well, Jake said.
In that voice. I wanted that, but at the end of the day, it's funny, so I talked to that same guy, who had those 40 names, and who I also quoted in that essay, is just being like, people are asking me if I'm okay, and I'm like, really? Is even feeling bad about this something that only I have to do? And I talked to him a couple months later, and he'd been working in Afghan resettlement, right? He's still working cases, but he's also helping people resettle, which I know you're doing as well. And he's in his local community. And one thing he said to me is like, it's actually been really good because there are all these people who've come out and they don't have any connection to Afghanistan, they don't have any connection to the military, but they come out and I was like, oh, like, people will step up if you ask them to. And one of the things, and this is one of the reasons I like to focus on those decisions that political leaders have made, is because I think for 20 years, we have aggressively asked people not to care. And so what do you expect?
Yeah, my feeling is, and I wrote this in the Atlantic, that the Biden administration underestimated the number of Americans who cared about Afghanistan because they thought they were going to pull out with no ripple across the surface of the war. People were just glad the war was over. And when it turned out that hundreds of thousands of Afghans were in peril and needed to get out, and we had prepared nothing to get them out. It turned out a lot of Americans actually were quite upset about that and spent weeks on their phones, on WhatsApp, trying to get people out. So you haven't really brought me into the light here, but you've explained the darkness that the essay ends with. So we should turn it over to the audience and see if anyone has questions for Phil.
I guess I'm curious how you view the Pentagon's power in setting the agenda and sort of, as you just noted, sort of, telling the American people that they don't need to care. Just go about living your life, pay your taxes, spend an extra $1 at Shaw's to support a veterans charity that's probably corrupt or whatever, doing something. And you were sort of a part of that system, and now are sort of trying, in some ways it seems, to sort of fight against it. And it feels, I would imagine, perhaps insurmountable just because of how massive it is, and the fact that it seems that, there's now other institutions outside of it that are supporting it, whether it's, like Top Gun, which obviously, existed in the Cold War as well, but, also politicians who are incredibly jingoistic, including veteran politicians, I think, as well as, just other sort of cultural institutions that are supporting this narrative.
I mean, I think if you look at the sum total of problems at any given time in history, it's very easy to be hopeless and filled with despair because there's a lot of problems and it feels like you as an individual have a limited ability to change things. I don't think that's actually the case. I think that, whatever issue you care about, there's sort of organizations that you can join yourself to, and I think it's only by joining with other people, institutions and organizations and broader structures that you sort of meaningfully move the needle. I mean, there's the Pentagon, but I think one of the things that we're dealing with is it's American politicians, right? And they're dealing with and they're responding to a kind of schizophrenic mood among the American public, right? So on the one hand, the forever wars are unpopular, right? It's very clear, whatever the reason that the wars were launched, the various different rationales for the different wars, a lot of that has not come to fruition, right? It's been a tremendous amount of waste, tremendous amount of failure. And at the same time, when ISIS rises up, Americans want ISIS people killed, right? And they don't want sort of rising terrorism. And I think that there's a way in which, so what we get is Obama increasing number of troops in Iraq and waging a war against ISIS while telling Americans that we're not at war. What we get is Joe Biden going before the UN and saying, I'm speaking as the first American president, not at war, and, just last month ordering more troops into Somalia to continue a campaign against Al-Shabaab, and, we have troops in a whole variety of places, and, not asking us to care about it at all. And so I think there are sort of obvious political incentives for that. I think there are ways in which these institutions are always more secretive than they need to be. We haven't had, we just don't allow reporters to embed with troops anymore, right? And we're somehow okay with that. We don't have Congress vote on the wars. We don't force the president to explain where we're killing people, why, what it's going to cost, what success is supposed to look like on a regular basis. We don't have Congress vote on that, right? And all of those things kind of contribute to the problem. And I also think that there's just far too much secrecy in general around, how we wage war. And the way that we wage war is not unrelated to the fact that it can be more secretive, right? We're relying on special operations troops, drones, airstrikes, proxy forces, and contractors, right? And mercenaries as well. All of which sort of, operate with kind of lower, quote Jake again, he did a piece where he interviewed a guy in, I think this is Special Forces, who was like, our job is to be America's French Foreign Legion, right? To be nobody's son or daughter. And so, if you're relying on those troops. It doesn't feel like you have any troops overseas, because it's not, for the most part, the 20-year-old, the kind of people who died in that bomb blast in Afghanistan in the last month, right? And so I think, yeah, there are a variety of reasons that we have the war that we have now. It's not just like the Pentagon driving it for nefarious purposes. I think it does actually kind of correspond in many ways to things that Americans want, and I think that it is related to sort of politically easy decisions that politicians have made that have kind of accumulated over time into a situation of warfare with a lot of, sort of downstream risk, right? Like, obviously, like, mercenaries are great, if you don't want to be seen as expanding America's military footprint. There are periods during Afghanistan where mercenaries were like 2.5 times more likely to die than actual American troops, but those don't count really in casualty numbers. And yet there are incredible, I could do a whole other thing on the sort of dangers of over-relying on mercenaries, especially the kind of way that we use it now, which sort of, we have this huge growth of mercenarism around the world with highly, highly skilled mercenarism, and it's sort of US contracts back off, and people want other contracts. So, to give a sort of long answer, yeah, there's a whole variety of problems. There's a whole set of institutions, not just like the Pentagon, right? That is the issue. But because there's a whole series of issues, there's also a lot of areas where you can sort of join groups that are trying to exert pressure to move things towards the better.
Sure, yeah, just a quick clarification. I mean, just in terms of your interactions, I assume you were like interacting with journalists when you were...
Yeah.
It seems that in many ways, the military is sort of the last trusted public institution. And I think that extends to, journalists to some degree, not to say that there aren't a lot of hard-nosed journalists asking tough questions and getting to the meat. But no one trusts them. Well, no one trusts them, correct. But I wonder if you sort of believe that there should be more skepticism, that perhaps there's too much trust, that perhaps the framing around these conflicts is, how much of that falls on the media, and and just if you ever get frustrated that certain narratives don't make it out there, because and that's sort of another thing of like, how brutal do the stories have to be? I mean, the essay you quote from, just these sort of like weird memories that sort of knock around in your head, some of which are pretty dark or like weirdly comic. How much of that is required? How much sort of like brutal, searing detail? How much politics? Like how does this all sort of alchemy get together to create a narrative that can inspire the public to engage and push a more responsible foreign policy?
I mean, that's the attempt, right? I mean, I don't think it's just about brutality, but I do think that I just, at the end of the day, I really do believe in the importance of in a longer form, really relentlessly looking into and explicating a topic over the course of an essay that delves into stories, that sort of gives you moments of both analysis and argument, but also experience, and tries to weave those together with historical context, and hopefully kind of, instead of giving you a kind of quick sort of plan for action, hopefully give you a sort of broader sense of what the field of debate even is.
One thing that you have written about is how the military increasingly draws from a kind of smaller and smaller pool of Americans, and more Americans that are related to each other, know one another, come from the same place, and are from kind of a less wide range of citizenry. I'm wondering how you think that affects today's military.
Yeah, a buddy of mine reached out to me and he was like, I don't know what you're talking about with this divide. He's like, everybody in my town is like either in the military or they just got out of the military. And I was like, yeah, you're in one of those places. It's like, he's like a little community in rural Maine, where everybody goes into the military, and and then I think it's a problem. I think that, you know, I think sometimes people talk a little bit too idealistically about the idea of a draft, right? As if it would like solve all of our problems.
Phil, when I was in Iraq, I asked a lot of troops, do you think there should be a draft? And I expected them to say, absolutely, why the hell should we be the only ones doing this? And every one of them said, God, no, we would never want all those people in there. Basically, the riffraff,
Did you talk to first sergeants? They definitely don't want it. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, I do really believe in national service, right? Like, I think that there's a way in which one of the things that I got out of the military was you're with a much wider group of people than you've ever encountered before, right? Like, you're totally outside of, you know, the bubble that you grew up in. And you're all working towards a common purpose for the common sort of national good. I think that's sort of inherently noble. It doesn't just need to be in the military. I do think it would be really, really good if as a country we had more avenues for national service for young people and sort of, and more of an expectation that you do something like that. But yeah, I think that the fact of the matter is now it's not just that we have a relatively small, all-volunteer military, right, which of course means that there's less sort of skin in the game for the average American, less engagement, less even understanding of what the military is. But, I mean, it's funny, like, I read Catch-22 before I joined the military and then afterwards, and I was like, oh, that's what a major is. Like, I didn't know, like, whether a sergeant was more than a major, or how the whole thing worked, you know, I was totally clueless the first time I read that book when I was in, I don't know, middle school or whatever. And, but even aside from that, you know, as I mentioned, like, we're using a small section of the military. We're not doing the large kind of troop deployments that we did, you know, when I was in the service. So it's a kind of even smaller group, even more self-selected, that are really responsible for how we're waging war now and killing people now and doing counterterrorism policy. And so that just it's a natural thing that I think we need to be conscious of and fight against.
It's interesting because there are a number of veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan who are now in Congress.
Mm-hmm.
And I talked to a number of them when I was writing about the fall of Kabul, and almost every one of them was incredibly impressive. Jason Crow from Colorado, Peter Meyer from Michigan, Kinzinger from Illinois, many others. And I think they have a sense of service that is almost obsolete now in Washington. They stand out in Congress because they're not just about building their own brand. But they all have it, maybe some of them do. Dan Crenshaw, yeah, there are some.
Oh, I mean, but talk about narratives of the military. That like Georgia ad where he jumps out of the plane. Have you seen this?
Yes,
it is crazy.
But they're the ones who are going to do well. This is
Yes.
my point. And the Jason Crows and Adam Kinzingers are either going to languish in obscurity or be written right out of their party, like Kinzinger. So it's as if we're taking all the built-up worth of service in 20 years of war and finding that there's members of Congress who have that experience, and yet we don't know what to do with it. It seems as if it's almost going to work against them if they still regard it in those terms.
I mean, I think you'll see more interest in military matters and often more knowledge, right? And more interest in doing real democratic, you know, accountability over our wars. You know, you get more buy-in on both sides of the aisle over stuff like the authorizations for the use of military force and such. But like veterans are like the general population or a whole mix. I mean, I remember I was walking with a Marine Corps vet, and we saw one of those like "I support the troops" signs, and he pointed. He's like, "I support like 90% of the troops." It's like there's 10% of the troops. I don't support those guys at all. Those guys suck. You know?
Point taken. Any more questions for Phil before we wrap it up? I just want to say, read the book. It's a wonderful piece of literature as well as of public thought and policy. So it's a great addition to your very promising, it's beyond promising, it's already fulfilled its promise, but it will continue to fulfill its promise career.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Greenlight. It's awesome to be back here.